Lots of people like to talk about values-based living and setting boundaries and healthy relationships. That's all lovely and nice until you're talking about a narcissistic family system. How the hell was this woman supposed to live in line with her values? How has your self-esteem been shaped by a narcissistic relationship? Self-esteem is a big part of the narcissism conversation on both sides. The people engaging in the narcissistic behavior and the people experiencing it. So let's start with the narcissistic folks. Okay, I've said I wasn't going to, but I'm going to, all right? So the conventional wisdom about self-esteem and narcissism has often been that narcissistic people have high self-esteem, that they love themselves, that they brag and they're grandiose. Some folks actually think that narcissism is a disorder of self-esteem. What we do know is that what we see in narcissistic folks is probably best called distorted self-esteem. At times, they see themselves in an overly inflated way, that they are the best, the greatest of all time. Nobody can beat them. Their distortions of self-esteem may extend to viewing themselves as being a great partner, a great friend, empathic, generous. Now that kind of puffed up part of them tends to happen when they're well supplied, that things are going their way. That's when we tend to see that hyped up, grandiose self-esteem. This can also happen when they are seeking out narcissistic supply. During the love bomb phase, or if they are trying to win someone over in business, the self-esteem might look like confidence all the time. But, and there's always a but, in a healthy person, self-esteem is stable and accurate. In a narcissistic person, if things in life aren't going exactly the way that they feel that they are entitled to have them go, you will see a crash in self-esteem, and they will be very quick to start positioning themselves as a victim, that everything is terrible, nothing will ever be good. And if you are in a relationship with them when they're having one of these downturns in their self-esteem, you may feel compelled to cheer them up and reassure them, keeping in mind that they never would have done this for you, of course. You may have even more empathy for them because their crash in self-esteem is in such contrast to their "I'm the best, nothing can touch me, I'm fire" approach. So you might even feel worse for them. Narcissistic people's self-esteem is entirely driven by external factors, which may be why they think of themselves as the king of the world at 9 a.m., and then believe that the world is a terrible place that will never understand their greatness and that their life will always be unfair by lunchtime. So the short answer is that narcissism is not about their high self-esteem, but rather it's more accurate to call it their fragile, reactive, unstable, and distorted self-esteem. But there is another, and I would argue more important side to this equation. The folks who are in narcissistic relationships. What about your self-esteem, right? Once again, conventional wisdom has it wrong, assuming that people who get into narcissistic relationships have low self-esteem. Not necessarily so. Many people who get into these relationships, when you got into the relationship, you might have actually been at the top of your game. It may very well have been why the narcissistic person was so attracted to you. When a narcissistic person seeks someone out, it's because it works for them, and that means supply and often status. So if you were doing well, that made you quite attractive to them. What happens to our self-esteem once we are in a narcissistic relationship is an entirely different story, though. Folks with lower self-esteem, when they first get into one of these relationships, may be more prone to getting stuck in one of these relationships. So while everyone is vulnerable to narcissistic folks, when we have lower self-esteem, the devaluation and the invalidation can almost feel more plausible. Our self-blame is more automatic. The idea that we're not enough is what we call egocentric. It's consistent with who we are. And we may feel as though we can't do better than someone who treats us like this. And in this way, folks who indeed do have lower self-esteem are part of the longer list of folks who are vulnerable to getting stuck in the narcissistic relationship. For example, people who are empathic, who are forgiving, who are rescuers, who are optimistic, are all vulnerable to getting stuck. But if you come in with healthy self-esteem, can a narcissistic relationship destabilize it? And sadly, the answer to that is yes. The challenge is that when we love someone and we believe that they love us, we trust their words of love, their opinions hold more weight. And if you didn't know what narcissism was, and obviously if this was apparent, there was no way of knowing it, it eats away at our self-esteem because we cannot be us. If we show up as us in the relationship, our authentic us, we will be shut down, we'll be shamed and told we're ungrateful or greedy or entitled or whatever we're told for expressing our needs. And so to be loved, we quit ourselves and we became what the narcissistic person wanted. It doesn't happen overnight, but it happens. And when that happens for long enough, no matter how healthy your self-esteem was when you got into this relationship, it will inevitably erode your self-esteem because at some level, your healthy self-esteem would represent a threat in this relationship. And we get indoctrinated into silencing ourselves so we don't ever leave them, the narcissistic people, feeling small or as though we're competition. But what about when we get out of the relationship? Can our self-esteem restore? Yeah. The more stable and accurate our self-esteem was to begin with, the smoother the process of healing. Remember, self-esteem is not about thinking about yourself as great. It is actually about seeing yourself accurately, seeing your strengths and your weaknesses, and valuing yourself as a human being. It's being able to see a bad thing happening as a bad thing happening, and not that you are a bad person that caused someone else to do a bad thing to you. It does slowly come back, your self-esteem. The less time you have to spend with the narcissistic person, the better. The less you have to be in the presence of gaslighting, manipulation, having to face their projected shame and invalidation, that's better for you. And even if you do still have to spend time with them, having some supports in your life that see you accurately and in a loving and empathic manner, and balanced with radical acceptance and seeing narcissism clearly, the self-esteem can clearly adjust. But I'm not going to pull punches here. The longer the relationship lasted, and the younger you were when the narcissistic relationship and the narcissistic abuse began, the deeper the roots of its harm. And those negative self-perceptions will pop up at vulnerable times. Have compassion for that when it happens, because it will, and take time to recalibrate. At some level, those internalized voices that continue to skew our perception of ourselves, yeah, they are an awful burden to bear, but they are also a wellspring of humility. Sometimes, when life gives you lemons or invalidation and gaslighting, you can at least try to make lemonade. Regaining an accurate sort of sense of self-esteem after you've experienced narcissistic abuse, it takes time. The self-blame lingers like burned rice at the bottom of a pan. The self-doubt can still make us tense about our decisions and leaves us ruminating about whether we did the right thing. Healing always takes time, and when the balance slowly restores away from invalidation and towards support and empathy, I promise you that you will find your center and that healthy self-esteem again. Not surprisingly, the self-esteem stuff for the narcissistic person, like most things about the personality style, it doesn't shift much. So as your self-esteem gets healthier, there will also be a sense of leaving them and the relationship behind you. Even if you stay in the relationship and you can start building up your self-esteem again, you will feel as though you've left this person behind. And that can sometimes raise some feelings of survivor guilt and shame. But please, ride it out and don't reach back down to them. Survival for all of us is a right, and healing even more so. Let's talk about what happened to your needs when you were in a narcissistic relationship. Where did they go? What happened to them? And how do you get them met now? The needless person. I wrote these words down after I had done one of the many podcast interviews I've been doing for this book, right? And I wrote the words down, and they wanted to think about them as a concept for something to bring to YouTube, right? And then I walked away from my desk. And a few days later, I looked down at the note on my desk, and I was confused. And I thought, what the heck does that, what was I meaning? When I wrote needless person, I was reading it now like needless to say, like a person we don't need. And then I remembered what I really meant. Because people often ask me, what kind of person does well, and I put well in quotes, with a narcissistic person, because obviously nobody really does well, but what kind of person may make it work? And it dawned on me that would be someone with very few needs and very little sense of self. Why would this be a person? Why would a person be like that? Lots of reasons. Severe trauma bonding since childhood, cultural factors that so incentivize just being what other people want of you and not yourself, lack of knowledge or education about these patterns, or being surrounded by other people who are living or have to live this way, right? So let's talk about this needless person, because this is literally what the narcissistic person really wants, though they would never articulate it that way, right? The needless person never articulates any needs, and they always put whatever needs they have second. And they've been indoctrinated into believing that not needing and giving in and taking care of others is virtuous or good, or they've learned that to be needless is the only way to survive. To have no needs and become needless could be a form of trauma response. Become what the other person wants, and then you are safe, connected, and attached. It's horrifying and it's tragic. But don't delude yourself into believing that this phenomenon is something that we'd only see in heavily authoritarian or inequitable cultures where, I don't know, for example, women may not have many rights. Nope. It's happening right near all of us. Think of how many people walk through the world. I see this on the internet and social media and articles and stuff. They'll say they try to view themselves as easy. I don't need anything. I don't make any demands. I'm just cool. I don't need you. I don't need anybody. I can just go with the flow. Folks, that's the modern version of the needless person. I don't need anyone. I can do it all myself, and I could just be cool and go along. Where it has been culturally twisted, though, is that we view this as being someone who's flexible, easygoing, modern, adaptable, basically have no needs, and you're a catch because you're so amenable. And you can easily see how a very strong person who values their own capacity to meet their own needs and go with the flow and never be perceived as needy or demanding, who views being easy breezy as making them more attractive, you can see, and if you don't, you should, can get someone horribly stuck in a narcissistic relationship. Because over time, I promise you at some point you will be criticized for having a need. And the trains in your life with a narcissist will generally run on time if you don't have any needs. But keep in mind that the narcissistic person will never pat you on the back and thank you or congratulate you for being so need-free. The needless person is a sad artifact of history meeting modern times, of sociological chickens coming home to roost, of the sense that the more easygoing you are, the better. A world where we confuse flexibility with having no needs. And let me tell you, the narcissistic people have glommed onto this. And when I see narcissistic relationships work, it is often because one person had to completely surrender, which is not good for the person who surrendered. Really, it is not. The evolution of a person becoming a needless person can begin in childhood, where the message from a narcissistic parent is, have no needs, become what I want, and you will be loved. The child may make needs known at some point, voice their needs, and then they'll be labeled as ungrateful or selfish, or they'll just have their needs ignored. And the child, who's needing to be attached or connected, slowly gives up on their needs and either figures things out themselves or collapses into helplessness. This can follow, these kinds of patterns can follow a person into adulthood, and then you can easily become the needless person. The narcissistic person doesn't necessarily target these so-called needless persons. They don't know initially. But what may happen is that the narcissistic person will take advantage of the needless person. The needless person may put up with the BS games that the narcissistic person plays. They call, they don't call, they text back, wait, then they text back a lot. And then they make you feel foolish if you voice your needs of wanting better communication in the relationship. The needless person may not feel their wants or needs with regard to communication will ever be honored, so they don't try. And the ground game quickly becomes what works for the narcissistic person in the relationship. Over time, the needless person is more likely to get stuck in one of these relationships because the dynamics of the relationship may simply go unquestioned. People who remain needless are at risk. They're at risk for not caring properly for themselves or advocating for themselves at a crucial time, like during a health crisis. We did a workshop in our healing program recently, and the number of people who were sharing that they've developed autoimmune conditions as a result or because of or while they were in narcissistic relationships is staggering. That sort of chronic, unrelenting stress and the absence of any of your needs ever being met. You may think that you're just being easy breezy, but all of that accumulates physiologically and hurts you. And you're at risk for missing out on meaningful opportunities in your life in terms of education, career, family, and just the stuff of life when you are needless. And most pointedly, you may not be able to discover and explore what happens to you when you're needless. The needless person is forever stuck in this subjugated web of service to the narcissistic person or the narcissistic system. But the needless person is still put out there as an ideal, perfect for rhetoric around how all relationships are sacrifice and difficult, that parenting is meant to be a one-way street of giving yourself up for your children for their entire lives, that we're supposed to work all the time without breaks or vacations. Compromise and sacrifice in relationships is not a bad thing per se. It is part of the equation of balance, but it only makes sense if it's being met and supported. That there's a reciprocity and mutuality, and you feel like you're being seen, heard, valued, and being actually allowed to be your true self. Frankly, under those conditions, if you're sacrificing, it doesn't feel like sacrifice. And a healthy partner or family or even a workplace will recognize if someone is not exerting their needs and check in on that and make sure that the person's okay. But if you are in a long-term or have been in a long-term narcissistic relationship, being needless sort of sadly, if you will, worked while it took a toll on you. I have to tell you, I remember as a child thinking that being ideal meant that you simply went along with everyone else. You caused no friction and you were easy and flexible and always enthusiastic about what other people wanted. But I was never taught the other half. That in a healthy relationship, two people or a group of people go along with each other, listen to each other's needs, meet each other halfway or at least part of the way. Needless to say, none of us should be needless. Healing means figuring out what yours are from the time, to space, to meaningful activities, to needing a snack, to the thermostat setting, to what temperature you want your water that you drink to be, to how you hope to communicate, to how you feel safe. Know these things and find spaces where you can express them. When you recognize there's folks in your world who shut you down, grieve that and then learn from that. Grief is not just a process, but it is also a mighty teacher. Sadly, we think that the counterweight to need less is needy, which implies desperate, sad, pathetic, right? The counterweight to needless is actually self-aware and self-compassionate. No human being should ever exist solely in the service of another. All of us have a basic human right to our true selves. The narcissistic people don't want to give you that, so don't go looking for it there. Find your safe spaces, even if initially they are with yourself, and let yourself need and know what you need. It may also make you less vulnerable and more discerning in narcissistic and in other toxic relationships. So one of the tough things when you're in a narcissistic relationship is figuring out your values or reminding yourself your values. Let's talk about values in these relationships. I was listening to someone share a difficult story recently. She had worked hard her entire life, put herself through school on her own dime, succeeded in an incredibly competitive industry, and she took some risks and chances that happened to pay off. She's also good at what she does. She'd been married to a narcissist. She got divorced from a narcissist. It was very expensive, and she went through the challenges of co-parenting while paying him spousal and child support and balancing child rearing. So after 30 years of really backbreaking work, she'd gotten really what was almost international acclaim. She'd made a decent amount of money. She wasn't rich, but she definitely was head and shoulders better than how she grew up, had more money than the average bear, and she was pretty comfortable. Her family of origin, though, not so much. They never sort of rose. And her family of origin was a very toxic system. Just about everyone was entitled. Nobody really encouraged her or ever offered encouraging words while she scraped by to make it and worked so hard. Anyone in her family ever took initiative. And when she finally made it, they took a stance of, well, you owe us. You were lucky and made it. And all of us are struggling. And they insisted that she owed them and had to pay their rent and sometimes spot them some money for some stupid new business they wanted to start or pay for a new car. Guilt often motivated her. It felt like almost a form of survivor guilt. She made it and succeeded, and she loved what she did for a living, and they didn't. And though it was manifestly clear to anyone looking at this story from the outside in that she worked hard and honestly for all of it, and they largely sat around and complained about how their lives were unfair, the old story, the trauma bonds and the intergenerational stuff and the guilt at being the one who succeeded all left her feeling like she owed them something, that she had had good fortune, and they were struggling. They were struggling because they were lazy and they never did anything. And so she felt compelled to do what she could to make their lives a little easier. It would take years before she could clearly see the narcissism and enabling and antagonism, and above all, for her to see that they weren't going to change. So for years before that, though, she spent buckets of money and time trying to make it all better. By the time she hit her early 60s, she wanted to slow down, take some time to no longer work 7 days a week, breathe, and enjoy what she created. But that damn family system, of course, none of them ever got it together. If you paid for college, they dropped out of school. They were getting fired from jobs for not showing up, and she introduced them to the people to get the jobs. They trashed the homes and apartments she got them or rented for them. They don't maintain the cars. And they had, like I said, grandiose dreams about ridiculous business ideas that they did not have the expertise to launch. The family system, again, was comprised of just people who were different kinds of toxic, vulnerably narcissistic, manipulative, entitled. They took no responsibility. And again, back to that entitlement. They all felt that she owed them something. She made it. So again, the idea was that she had to lift all of their boats. As she got older, from her 50s into her 60s, she still felt very beholden to an aunt and her mother who had both had very difficult lives and who both variously enabled their own adult children. The woman felt that she had to ensure that her aunt and mother, who were both getting quite old, were taken care of. She found a great setup for them that would offer them care and meals and all that other stuff, and she offered to pay for it. But the aunt and mom didn't want to move from their respective apartments, not because the place she was offering to them wasn't good, but the aunt and mother were enabling their entitled adult children, who had all failed to launch and who were all living with them. So if they moved to a place where they would have to move alone to be cared for, their kids who were sponging off of them would have nowhere to go. Because the woman refused to keep paying up the rents on these apartments and homes, and she would sell the home, and she would sell the home she bought for her aunt and her mother and the apartment she had rented for one of them, and get them set up in a comfortable place where they would be looked after, but that meant all of these other adult children would be out on the street. Because this woman wanted to retire, she wanted to manage her money in a way that she would ensure that her mother and aunt got taken care of for the remainders of their lives and had what they needed. But keeping up the house that she had bought them, and which their adult children had really trashed after moving into it, was beyond her financial means because she wouldn't be making as much money. It all makes sense, right? Well, the aunt and the mother refused to move. Again, not because they didn't value the other place, but because they were trying to ensure that the failed other adult children would have a place to live. So I'm sorry for this long story, but I am sure many of you have known variants of this. This woman, after doing the right thing for nearly 65 years and caring for multiple elders in her family, getting them a home, paying for carers, getting meals organized, ensuring that these older adults had walking around money, and giving a leg up to everyone else in her family, and nobody ever stepped up and adulted in her family, she was done. And if you asked this woman what her values were, she would have said discipline, hard work, kindness, ambition, respect, and duty. A sense of duty and obligation for her mother and aunt were key values to her, and to a much, much lesser degree, her children, who had long since taken advantage of her generosity. But with the aunt and mother's refusal to move, this woman was in a bind. She would have to stop paying for many of the things that they needed as her income dropped, and she needed to ensure she had savings accumulated to take care of herself in her older age. But had they moved to that place, that other place that they were familiar with, that she would paid for, it would have been affordable for her to ensure their care and to see them frequently. But the aunt and mom, again, weren't moving because their adult children didn't want to find their own places to live, and their adult children were manipulating them to stay in place. And because this woman also paid the utility and the heating bills and all the other bills that would come with that, right now all of that was covered because the woman was paying for it. The devastation for this woman was that she was going to have to give up on her values of duty and obligation and step away from the situation. She did this little by little. Things were slowly slipping away. She no longer gave her mother and aunt money because they were giving ATM cards to their kids and the accounts were getting depleted. The internet got turned off because this woman wouldn't pay for it anymore. She simply made sure that there was a landline. She stopped paying for a cell phone plan. She gave the mother and the aunt burner phones for use in an emergency. The gravy train stopped for these other loser adult children. But the grief for this woman was that she felt she was giving up on fundamental values for herself, of really taking care of her elders, in the face of them not cooperating, and seeing that the mom and aunt were enabling their adult children who were living, in essence, rent-free, using that free internet, using the aunt and the mother's cell phones. And a big part of this woman's identity was locked into doing the right thing by these older family members. The entitlement, the enabling, the toxicity, and the narcissistic patterns that hadn't shifted in over 40 years meant that she was having to take uncomfortable steps to actually take care of herself in a really real way. Had she kept spending money the way she was, she simply would not have had enough money for her own process of aging and need for care down the line. And we can say clearly that none of these family members are going to step in and help her. It was still early days. Is only at this point the internet had been turned off, but there were already accusations that this woman was selfish for what she was doing, because she was no longer paying for everything for everyone, and she was letting down the aunt and the mother. And she was being characterized as leaving her mother and aunt high and dry. Family members started sending her really mean text messages. It didn't matter that most of their lives had largely been bankrolled in one way or another by this woman. When she had to make a practical decision and offered an excellent, probably even better option for these elderly family members, she was told that she was selfish and dishonorable and wasn't doing her duty by them. But the harder hit was for her. This is what I mean when I saw when I say this idea that the boundaries conversation is ridiculous. She set what could be called a boundary, and that so-called boundary flew in the face of her own value system. To not care for older adults in her family was literally a violation of her own value, her own key core values of duty and responsibility. And that was a core part of her identity. This woman's process of healing was identifying and getting back to her values, but at the same time, healing and simple survival meant that she could no longer live in line with those values. Lots of people like to talk about values-based living and setting boundaries and healthy relationships. That's all lovely and nice until you're talking about a narcissistic family system. How the hell was this woman supposed to live in line with her values? In these families, there's no such thing as doing the right thing. In her case, she did the right thing 1,000 times, and in many ways. She made educational opportunities and other opportunities available. She made jobs available for the younger generations of the family. They would drop out of school. They would drop out of the job she found them. She'd drop out of the internship she connected to them. And they would play the victim. They didn't take me seriously. She learned in those situations with the children, with the younger generations and her siblings, to give up more quickly. And she'd given up on all of them years before, and that was hard enough for her. She still felt she was abandoning a role in her family and giving up on people. But with her aunt and mother, she had very much done the right thing, buying them an affordable home, paying people to care for them when they needed it, ensuring that they had some little walking around money, ensuring that their health care, she followed up on all that paperwork. But when the mother and the aunt became enablers in a way that was financially actually dangerous for her, there was no way for this woman to split things up and say, you can be here, but the rest of them have to go. This wasn't a conservatorship situation or anything like that. The mother and aunt were of sound mind. But it was a glimpse into the layers and layers and layers of harm that toxic dynamics can create. And having to grapple with the idea that the mother and aunt were choosing the more griftery arm of the family over her after her years of help made their lives and care possible was devastating. And that even after years of doing the right thing, the story would end with the final chapter being that she was selfish and walked away when the two family elders needed her. Boundaries sound good on paper and as pat advice, but we have to ask ourselves the questions about the internal sacrifices that we may have to make to be able to set external boundaries. This woman intellectually recognized that she had to do what she had to do, but she lived in grief and rumination about putting her aunt and mother in what felt like a very suboptimal situation. She said she was open to the day that her aunt and mom, or either of them as individuals, would actually work with her on a situation that could work for her mother and aunt. But as long as the siblings and cousins and other hangers-on were playing victim and telling her mom and aunt that, oh, this woman was taking advantage of them, she recognizes that that's not going to happen. And I have no doubt that many of you hear elements of her story as yours. When I heard her sharing it, I could feel the helplessness in me. And I could see the competing demands of having to not lose herself to a harmful family system, living in accordance with her values, especially of duty to her family, and then recognizing that that meant leaving some of the enablers that she loved and worried about behind, and doing what felt like giving up on her values and frankly giving up on people. Those don't feel like choices. So when we think about this, living in line with one's values, and ultimately then how do you make that work? That at some point, these folks would have let this woman get completely sucked dry. And she knows that this may very well culminate in a rather disastrous circumstance, but that you're caught in this eternal game of chicken if you try to set a boundary, if you even want to call it that, in a narcissistic relationship. Ultimately, when we do the work of saving ourselves in these relationships, we will always be called selfish. And for this woman, the writing was on the wall. This family had no problem bringing this woman to bankruptcy. They've always lived close to the bone. To them, making that ask of her was nothing. But for her, there was still a self-preserving part of her that remained strong. That said, she still, despite all the success and all the hard work, this grief remained a prevailing emotion for her because she could not live in line with her values. And that is a paradox of the narcissistic relationship. So it can be really challenging while you're healing because it can feel like it's taking a long time. And yet you're trying to move into your new future and trying to meet new people. Let's talk about that. So people healing from narcissistic relationships will say, almost without exception, that one of the most difficult things about moving forward is meeting new people, right? And that means meeting new friends. But it shows up most pointedly in people trying to meet new partners. Our natural and healthy urge to want to be in healthy relationships comes up against the absolute terror and fear of being betrayed and harmed and confused again. So you feel like a yo-yo, feeling like I want to love and be loved, and then I'm scared of relationships. And then you're kind of caught in a purgatory of finding safety only when you're alone, but also craving closeness and relationship. And the back and forth can look like ambivalence to other people and to ourselves. Maybe I don't really want a relationship. You do, but integrating all of this, the harm you experience in a relationship, the confusion and the drive to be close, can just keep people feeling like they're not moving anywhere. Not forwards, not backwards, just frozen. So as part of healing, I talk a lot about discernment. And discernment is tough because in order to discern, you have to trust yourself. And people who've been through narcissistic relationships don't trust themselves. They'll think things like, well, clearly my picker is off, or I'm the one who kept going back to that toxic relationship, or clearly something's wrong with me, that kind of thing. But it's actually not that. You chose someone and they mistreated you. That's on them, not on you for choosing this relationship. But that can leave you feeling as though you can't do this, that you will keep picking toxic friends and toxic partners. But before you learned about narcissism, discernment is tough because many of you didn't even know this was a thing. And once you realized that it was, Just that little bit of education that this is a pattern can mean that you're seeing these patterns more clearly. And yes, you will spy it. But no matter how much you know about it, you're still going to meet more narcissists. They're out there. Also, this idea of wanting a relationship, but also being afraid of relationships, some of that relates to that fear of getting stuck again and finding it hard to get out. I've said this many times. This is not so much about the choosing a narcissistic partner or person, or a narcissistic person choosing you. This is about the patterns in these relationships unfolding. And even when you start to feel them or see them, you may feel frozen, stuck, trauma bonded, and not know how to get out. Fear, hope, confusion, pity, all can keep you sort of with a sense of feeling stuck or not being able to make a decision. And that fear around getting stuck can also make it feel scary to get back into a relationship, because the idea of having to get out of one of these things again just feels too overwhelming. Discernment is about moving slowly, listening to your body, paying attention to patterns, writing it down if you need to. And yes, it can take a second to see it. But when you do, being willing to disengage, not all at once, but take a few steps back, get more data, pay attention to your body, and keep moving slowly. This is not easy to do. It definitely takes some process of healing, and we're all, no matter how much we heal, we're still going to make mistakes. However, we also have to be careful to not overcorrect. Obviously, there are big ticket things that people can do in the beginning of a relationship that should just be no-fly things for us, like screaming, physical abuse, rage, cheating. But as we know, lots of stuff that happens in these relationships, especially early, is subtle under the radar stuff. They're not going to start beating you up on a first date. It might be a mild gaslight, or minimizing us in front of other people, or making us feel small, or making a joke at our expense more than once. Things that people could easily say, oh, come on, don't make such a big deal out of that, and can leave us wondering if we are reading this right. Then there are even milder things that can happen. A person who shows up late for a date or a meetup. The person who may have a difference of opinion from you. The person who may cancel a date at the last minute. The challenge for people who are trying to learn and practice discernment is the hair trigger moment for us, and even at mild moments. For example, someone cancels a date because they're sick. And you then say, oh my gosh, this isn't safe. They've canceled on me. I'm out of here. In essence, even one mistake means that the whole thing goes down. So how do we find the balance between not letting one missed phone call or a late arrival be the reason to cut someone out, but also not stay in something that is veering into a unhealthy, maybe even manipulative space? Where is that line? Because discernment is in that line, right? Many survivors overcorrect. And when they start dating, may say, oh no, that's a mistake, and then boom, blocks them. Since nobody is perfect, the mistake-seeking approach, it's not discernment. It's post-traumatic safety seeking. It's a perception of threat, and it is totally understandable. But using that approach is going to impede the ability to get into any kind of new relationship, including a friendship, because everybody makes mistakes. Viewing discernment as a sort of middle path becomes the key. Seeking support can't just be reckless abandon and allowing anyone into our lives and sharing too much of ourselves too soon. But it also can't be rejecting someone after one human error that wasn't cruel or abusive, but it's the stuff that happens, like flat tires and stomach bugs. When we think that discernment is just zero tolerance, we miss the boat, because it's not. People are human, and when the misattuned moment or the mistake or life happening happens, we can discern by looking at the response. The person may communicate and say, I am so sorry, I am canceling because I don't want to make you sick. But can we please find a hard, fast date we can reschedule for next week? I'm so sorry for changing this at the last minute. That's very different than someone saying to you, I am sick, and then getting really angry at you for being disappointed. Or they may lie about being sick, and they may not even want to make another plan. It's not the mistake per se, but the repair, the connection, the capacity to keep connecting despite it. And when you have been through a narcissistic relationship, you don't get that. And so we learn that it's one error and you're out. And while it can feel very protective to do it this way, it may also prevent you from really making any more connections. Black and white is so much easier. And that fracturing we feel within ourselves in these relationships can almost parallel that need for wanting easy black and white metrics for how to make decisions. But healing isn't easy. Healthy, meaningful relationships mean growing from the mistakes. After years of learning that our mistake, if we even did one little thing wrong, it meant blow-ups and rage fests. Mistakes can feel like scary places in relationships. Discernment means learning the differences between small m mistakes, if you will, and big M mistakes. Between being blamed for having a feeling versus experiencing repair, restoration, and general accountability and empathy by another person. Is there a quick fix to it? No. Unfortunately, you have to take the time, kind of calibrate, develop support, do the therapy to find that middle between wanting love and fearing it, of not running at the first missed date, but not justifying patterns of abusive behavior. There are no absolutes or black and white in human relationships. And the fact is, healthy love and connection all happen in the gray. Where it gets interesting is that the gray isn't always a thing in narcissistic relationships. And discernment is learning that we actually got a bad bill of goods and we're told that there was a black and white playbook. But there's not. And when it's not, we need to learn to tolerate that anxiety. Thanks again.